I still remember the smell of dust that morning, dry, sharp, and endless. It clung to our clothes, our hair, our skin, until we looked as though we'd been made from the same dirt that stretched in every direction. When the truck stopped, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind moving across the Texas plains, brushing over the barbed wire fences and the faded sign that read Miller Ranch. For months, we'd been told what to expect. We were prisoners, after all, enemy women sent across the ocean to work the land while the men fought a war. We'd learned to keep our eyes down, our hands ready, our hearts closed. And yet, when the gate opened, nothing looked as we imagined. There were no guard towers, no barking dogs, no men shouting orders. Just wide skies, horses grazing near a corral, and a man in a sun-bleached hat standing by a barn door. He didn't look like the enemy. He looked like the land itself, weathered, quiet, impossible to read. "Welcome to Miller Ranch," he said in slow, careful English, his voice low but clear. "You work, you eat, you respect the land, and it'll respect you back." His name was James Miller. I learned later he'd lost his brother in the fighting overseas. But that day, there was no anger in his eyes, only something that looked like exhaustion and a strange, cautious patience. We didn't trust it. None of us did. We'd seen too much to believe kindness wasn't just another trap. Our first days were silent ones. We cleaned the barns, mended fences, and gathered feed under the sun that burned through the fabric of our clothes. The land didn't care who we were. It demanded everything: sweat, skin, breath, until there was nothing left but motion. And maybe that's why, slowly, we began to breathe again. Then there was him, the horse they called Midnight. I saw him before I ever spoke to Miller. A wild mustang, black as smoke, standing alone at the far edge of the corral. He didn't move when people approached, only flicked his ears and showed the whites of his eyes. The men said he'd thrown every rider who tried to tame him. Some thought he was cursed. Others said he just needed breaking. When I looked at him, I saw something I didn't expect: fear. Not anger, not pride, just raw, silent fear. The first time Miller caught me watching, he said quietly, "He won't let anyone close." Not yet. His tone was soft, but it carried a kind of truth that settled deep inside me. I didn't answer. I didn't have words for the recognition. I felt that strange connection between two creatures who'd both been taken from what they knew and told they were dangerous. Days passed into weeks. We worked from dawn to dusk, our world measured by the rhythm of chores: water, feed, clean, repeat. But slowly, the ranch began to change us. We spoke less of home, less of war. There was something grounding about the work, something that made us feel, for the first time in years, like people again. One afternoon, Miller asked me to help him repair a section of fence near the pasture. I hesitated, not because I feared him, but because I didn't know how to stand beside someone who didn't treat me like a number. "You're not a prisoner here," he said, noticing my unease. "You're a worker, that's all." I didn't know whether to believe him, but he handed me a hammer and pointed toward a row of posts. The air shimmered with heat, and the silence between us stretched wide. Then, as if he could sense the storm inside my chest, he said quietly, "Wild doesn't mean broken, just means hurt. Hurt can heal, if someone's patient enough to wait." For a moment, I forgot the uniform on my back. I forgot the fences and the past and the labels that had defined everything. His words weren't about the horse. They weren't even about the war. They were about us, all of us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of Midnight, of Miller's calm voice, of the way the sunset had turned the horizon the color of rusted gold. Something inside me shifted, something I hadn't felt since before the world collapsed. Hope. Not the loud, shining kind that fills speeches or parades. The quiet kind, fragile, unsure, the kind that grows in the cracks left by loss. As the weeks passed, I began spending more time near the corral. Midnight would watch me from a distance, ears twitching, muscles tense. I didn't try to touch him. I just stood nearby, talking softly about nothing at all. Sometimes he'd look away. Sometimes he'd take one cautious step closer before retreating again. I knew better than to rush it. Healing, I'd learned, doesn't come from force. It comes from staying, from showing up, day after day, even when nothing seems to change. By the end of summer, the wind over the plains had started to cool. The grass turned pale, the sky sharper. The war felt far away here, almost like a rumor. But one morning, when Miller called us together and said there would soon be visitors from the government, I saw a shadow pass through his eyes. I didn't know it yet, but that shadow would change everything. By September, the fields around Miller Ranch had turned gold. The air carried that dry sweetness that comes just before harvest, when summer is fading but not yet gone. Each morning, mist clung to the corral fences before the sun burned it away, leaving everything sharp and bright. Life on the ranch had settled into a rhythm not easy, not gentle, but steady. We rose before dawn, our hands raw and our backs sore, yet none of us complained anymore. The ranch didn't reward words, it rewarded effort. Somewhere between fixing fences and feeding horses, the bitterness we'd carried began to loosen its grip. The land didn't care where you came from. It only asked what you could give. I spent most mornings near the corral, where midnight still paced the edges like a restless spirit. At first, Miller pretended not to notice my fascination. He'd lean against the fence, straw hat pulled low, pretending to study the ground while quietly watching both of us. One day, he finally spoke. "You ever worked with horses before?" I hesitated, surprised he was speaking to me directly. "No," I said, "only with machines, in Hamburg." He nodded slowly. "Machines don't have eyes like that," he said. He handed me a small bucket of feed and gestured toward the corral. "Try holding it near him. Don't move too fast." I walked toward the gate, heart pounding. Midnight snorted, his ears flicking back, muscles tight as wire. I stood still, waiting. Dust swirled between us. After a long moment, he stepped forward, not much, just one cautious stride, then stopped again. His nostrils flared. I could feel his breath from where I stood. He didn't eat that day, but he didn't bolt either. It was a beginning. That became our routine, me and midnight, Miller somewhere nearby. Every morning, the same slow ritual of trust. I'd stand by the fence, talking softly about the weather, the chores, anything that came to mind. He'd listen, twitching an ear now and then. Sometimes I'd hum an old song from home, not out of nostalgia, but because it filled the silence better than words. One morning, while I was brushing the dust from the rail, Miller spoke again. His voice was low, as if afraid to disturb the peace. "My brother used to whistle while he worked," he said. "Couldn't carry a tune to save his life." It was the first time he'd mentioned family. I didn't ask questions, just waited. "He was 19, he continued after a moment. Said he wanted to see the world. Never came back." The way he said it, quiet, without anger, stayed with me. There was grief there, yes, but not hatred. Only the hollow kind of pain that never fully leaves. Later that day, as we stacked hay near the barn, I caught him watching me again, not in judgment, but curiosity. I think he was trying to understand how someone like me, who spoke the language of his brother's enemies, could care so much about a frightened horse. That evening, he walked me back to the bunkhouse as the sun bled into the horizon. "You're patient," he said. "Most people give up when they don't see change right away." "Maybe because I know what it feels like to be given up on," I replied before I could stop myself. He didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "Maybe that's why you're the one he trusts." The days grew shorter, the evenings colder. The women had started laughing again, small things, quiet moments between chores. We made bread together, shared scraps of memories that no longer hurt as much to speak aloud. The ranch had become something strange and precious, a place that didn't erase the past, but made it bearable. One night, near the end of October, Miller invited us all to a small harvest gathering. The local families came too, bringing music and food. I hadn't seen that many smiles in years. Lanterns hung from the barn beams, swaying gently in the warm breeze. At first, the townsfolk kept their distance. We were, after all, the foreign women from the camp. But as the night wore on, suspicion gave way to curiosity. Someone started playing a fiddle, and laughter spilled out like water from a cracked jar. I watched from the sidelines until Miller found me near the door. "You should dance," he said. "I don't know how," I told him. He smiled. "Neither do I." "That's why it's fun." He offered his hand, rough from years of work. I hesitated, then took it. The music was clumsy and loud, and we both moved awkwardly, out of rhythm, out of practice. But for the first time in years, I forgot to be afraid. When the song ended, the crowd clapped and someone shouted for another tune. I caught Miller's eye, and in that instant, I saw what the war had almost erased, the simple truth that kindness still existed. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I slipped out to the corral. Midnight stood under the stars, calm and still. When I held out my hand, he didn't flinch. For the first time, He let me touch his neck. His coat was warm beneath my fingers. He sighed, lowering his head slightly, a small, wordless surrender. And in that moment, I understood. Sometimes healing begins not with grand gestures or forgiveness, but with the quiet act of staying near the pain until it no longer hurts to breathe. The time November came, frost glazed the grass each morning. The ranch, once alive with color, had turned pale and quiet. We wrapped ourselves in borrowed coats and scarves, our breath visible in the dawn air. Yet the work never stopped. Neither did the peace that had slowly grown between us and the land. Every morning, I went to the corral before the others awoke. Midnight would be waiting, his dark coat gleaming faintly in the gray light. He no longer shied away when I approached. I could brush him now, whisper to him, even rest my forehead against his shoulder. There was a comfort in that routine, a rhythm. I learned to trust the steady breath of a creature who once known only fear. Miller watched from a distance most days, pretending to check the fences or clean the tack. But I knew he was watching us both, not just the horse, but me. Sometimes when our eyes met, there was a question there neither of us dared to speak. Then, one cold afternoon, the trucks came. They appeared without warning, two olive-green vehicles grinding up the dirt road, tires spitting dust. The ranch dogs barked until Miller called them off. Men in long coats stepped out, their boots crisp and their expressions sharper than the air. One of them, a tall officer with polished buttons, scanned the yard as if he owned it. "Mr. Miller?" he asked. Miller nodded. "That's right. We're here on behalf of the Department of War," the man said briskly. "There've been concerns about your arrangement here. Unauthorized contact, excessive freedom, fraternization." The word landed heavy. The women froze. I felt my stomach tighten. Miller's jaw shifted slightly. "These people work hard," he said. "They've done nothing wrong. That's not for you to decide," the man replied. "These prisoners were sent here for labor, not leisure." Something in Miller's face hardened, but he stayed calm. "You think mending fences and hauling hay is leisure?" The officer ignored him. His gaze swept over us, assessing, calculating, cold. When his eyes met mine, I looked away. Later, in the bunkhouse, whispers filled the air. Some of the women cried quietly, packing what little they had. Others stared at the floor, too numb to speak. I sat by the window, watching the officers outside with their clipboards and orders, and felt a familiar fear return, the fear of being unseen, unchosen, unwanted. That night, Miller came to speak to us. He stood by the doorway, hat in hand. "They'll be taking you to another facility in a few days," he said. "Closer supervision," they said. He tried to sound calm, but his voice broke on the last words. "Is there nothing you can do?" I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw defeat in his eyes. "I've tried," he said quietly, "but sometimes the world doesn't listen. No matter how loud you speak." No one moved. The silence pressed down on all of us like the cold itself. The next morning, I went to the corral early. The frost sparkled on the rails, and Midnight stood waiting, pawing at the ground as if sensing the unease. When I tried to brush him, he pulled away, restless. It was as though he knew something was ending. Miller appeared beside me, his breath visible in the cold. "He doesn't like goodbyes," he said softly. "Neither do I," I whispered. He watched me for a long moment, then said, "You've done more for that horse than anyone ever could. You gave him back his trust. And what about you?" I asked before I could stop myself. He smiled faintly, a tired, sad smile. "Maybe you gave me a bit of that too." The officers left their papers on the kitchen table that afternoon. Orders signed, sealed, and final. We were to be moved within the week. That evening, Miller hitched his truck and drove into town. When he came back, he was carrying something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to me without a word. Inside was a small silver charm shaped like a horse. "For luck," he said, "or remembrance, whichever you need more." I held it tightly, unable to speak. There were no grand gestures between us, no promises, just that small token and everything unspoken that it carried. The next few days passed in a blur of chores and packing. I spent every spare moment near Midnight. The morning of our departure, I slipped out before sunrise to see him one last time. The air was sharp, the sky a deep gray before dawn. I rested my hand on his neck and whispered, "Be good, my friend. You're free now." He turned his head slightly, brushing his muzzle against my shoulder. It was enough. When the trucks arrived, Miller stood by the gate, hat pulled low, eyes shadowed. None of us said goodbye out loud, it would have hurt too much. As the truck jolted forward, I looked back once. He stood there, a single figure in the dust, one hand raised in a quiet salute. Through the rattling noise of the engine, I could still hear his words echoing in my mind. Wild doesn't he mean broken? And as the ranch disappeared behind the horizon, I realized he hadn't just been talking about the horse. He'd been talking about all of us. I never saw the plains of Texas again, not in person at least. But for years afterward, whenever the wind rustled through wheat fields or the air carried the smell of hay and dust, I was back there standing by the corral, the sun low on the horizon, and the world feeling wide and kind again. When they transferred us, the new camp was nothing like Miller Ranch. Barbed wire surrounded everything, tall fences casting shadows over gray barracks. Guards shouted more than they spoke, and work became mechanical, heavy, endless, without meaning. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was something quieter, colder. We were back to being numbers again. At night, lying on the hard cot, I would close my eyes and think of midnight, the warmth of his breath, the steady weight of his trust. I would picture Miller, standing at the fence line, his hat tipped against the wind. I never knew if he missed us or if life simply went on, as it must. But in my heart, I kept the memory of that place like a small fire, one that refused to go out. When the war finally ended, they told us we could return home. Some of the women cried with joy. Others, like me, just stared at the ground. Home. The word felt unfamiliar. Germany wasn't the same country we'd left, and we weren't the same women who had gone away. I stood in line for my papers, the silver horse charm still tucked in my pocket. It had become warm and smooth from my touch, the only thing I couldn't bear to part with. When it was my turn, an officer asked if I intended to go back. "You have a choice," he said, scanning the list. "Repatriation or resettlement." Choice. It was a word I hadn't heard in years. I thought about Hamburg, the ruins, the faces of people who had once been proud and now only looked tired. I thought about Miller Ranch, about how a man who had every reason to hate us had chosen kindness instead. And for the first time, I realized what freedom truly was. It wasn't about borders or uniforms. It was about the ability to decide who you wanted to be when no one was telling you anymore. The paperwork took months, and by the time I stepped off the bus in a small Texas town, winter had turned the world silver. The air smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. I rented a small room above a bakery and found work helping with deliveries. People stared, sometimes the accent, the strange name, but no one was unkind. It took nearly a year before I found the courage to visit the ranch again. The road looked the same, long and red with dust, stretching into the horizon. The wind carried bits of grass and the faraway sound of cattle bells. When I reached the gate, my hands were trembling. Miller was there, mending a fence, just as he'd been that first day. He looked older, the lines on his face deeper, his hair more gray than brown. For a moment, he didn't recognize me. Then his eyes softened, and he smiled, that quiet smile I'd never forgotten. "Well," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans, "you took your time." I laughed, though my voice shook. "I wasn't sure I'd be welcome." He shook his head. "You were never unwelcome." We didn't talk about the past, not the war, not the transfer, not the pain. Some things are better left in silence. Instead, we talked about the land, the horses, the long, dry summer that had nearly ruined the crops. He told me Midnight was still there, older now but gentle, still grazing in the same pasture. When I saw him again, his coat had faded slightly, but his eyes were calm, content. I walked up slowly, the way I had years ago, and he leaned into my hand like an old friend. Miller watched from the fence. "He remembers," he said softly. I turned to look at him. So do I. In the years that followed, I stayed, not as a prisoner, not as a stranger, but as a worker, a neighbor, and eventually, a partner in the quiet life that grew between us. The ranch became our shared language, the place where pain had turned into purpose. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low over the plains and the cicadas began to sing, Miller would rest his hand over mine and whisper, "See, even the wild ones learned to trust again." He was right. Decades later, long after he was gone and my own hair had turned white, I would sit on the porch and watch the horses move through the tall grass, their shadows long and graceful in the evening light. The world had changed many times since those days, but what we built there never faded. People who visited would ask about the photograph on my wall. A young man in a dusty hat, a black horse behind him, and a woman standing nearby, her hand resting gently on its neck. I always smiled and said, That was the day I learned that enemies are only enemies until someone chooses to see their humanity. And if they listen closely, they might notice that even now, when the wind was just right, it carried the faint sound of hooves on the dry Texas earth, steady, certain, alive. Because kindness, like a well-built fence, can outlast the storm. Some stories remind us that kindness can outlive even the hardest times. If this one touched your heart, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep the quiet stories of humanity and hope alive, one memory at a time.